The phone rang at precisely 3:15 p.m., the time that would forever mark the end of a long, dangerous obsession. On the other end, a panicked voice, barely audible over the chaotic breathing, uttered the chilling words, "He's dead. I did it. I killed him." The voice belonged to none other than Rebecca Lawson, the assistant to the CEO of one of the most influential tech companies in the country. But what had driven her to kill the man who had held the reins of the company and her future in his hands? Rebecca had worked for CEO Jonathan Walters for over 5 years. From the outside, their professional relationship appeared seamless. She was the competent, sharp-witted assistant, and he, the powerful, charismatic leader of a multi-billion-dollar corporation. But behind the polished walls of Walters Technologies, a much darker story was unfolding. Days earlier, Walters had become increasingly obsessed with Rebecca, crossing boundaries that were never to be crossed. Despite Rebecca's efforts to distance herself, his advances grew more brazen, his demands more controlling. He had put her in an impossible situation: push back and lose everything, or comply and give in to a dangerous game. By the time the call came in, everything had spiraled out of control. What had started as a professional relationship had descended into a nightmare of manipulation, deceit, and violence. But who exactly was to blame? The man who could have crushed her career in an instant? Or the assistant who could no longer take it? The truth would soon come to light, but the question remained: could this murder be justified? Or was it just another shocking betrayal hidden behind a facade of ambition? In the heart of Silicon Valley stood Walters Technologies, a towering monument to success and innovation. Led by Jonathan Walters, a 45-year-old CEO with a reputation for sharp intellect and relentless ambition, the company had become a dominant force in the tech world. Walters was known for his cold, calculated decisions, traits that had earned him millions but also alienated those around him. He was a man of power, respected and feared by colleagues and competitors alike. Rebecca Lawson, 28, had joined Walters Technologies 5 years ago, quickly rising through the ranks to become Walters' personal assistant. On the surface, Rebecca appeared to be the model employee, intelligent, efficient, and driven. But beneath her professional exterior, she was trapped in a dangerous game. Walters had started to blur the lines between their work relationship and personal boundaries, crossing into obsession. His attempts at control became increasingly evident, and Rebecca found herself caught in his web of manipulation. What appeared to be a standard professional relationship was deteriorating into something far more sinister. The balance of power had shifted, and Rebecca, feeling cornered and desperate, was forced to make a choice that would change everything. The evening of the murder unfolded like a chilling crescendo, each moment stacking on top of the last in a series of inevitabilities. June 17, 2021, had begun like any other day at Walters Technologies. The high-rise building hummed with activity as employees bustled in and out of meetings, phones rang constantly, and the steady rhythm of the office life continued. But inside Jonathan Walters' penthouse office, a far more sinister energy hung in the air. Rebecca had arrived at the office early that morning, as she always did, to prepare Walters' schedule for the day. The atmosphere was tense. Walters had become more erratic in his behavior, his advances towards her more forceful. For months, Rebecca had done her best to keep things professional, distancing herself from his increasingly inappropriate comments. But as the day wore on, it was clear something had shifted in Walters. He was becoming desperate. At 2:30 p.m., Walters called Rebecca into his office. His demeanor was cold, distant, different from the CEO she had come to know. He told her that they needed to have a serious conversation. Rebecca, now accustomed to his moods, assumed it was another attempt to exert control. He had been pressuring her for weeks, asking her to attend after-hours meetings, insinuating that their relationship could go beyond the professional, despite her repeated refusals. But this time, it was different. This time, Walters was adamant. He stood up from behind his desk and walked toward her, his movements deliberate. He began to press her to accept his advances, alluding to her potential career advancement if she complied. His words were manipulative, veiled threats disguised as promises of success. But Rebecca had reached her breaking point. She had stayed silent, tolerating his behavior in the hope that it would stop, but now it seemed he was prepared to push her into a corner. She was trapped. Rebecca's mind raced as he closed the distance between them. She had to get away. This was no longer just a work relationship. Walter's obsession had crossed into dangerous territory. The confrontation that followed was brief but intense. Walters, sensing her resistance, became increasingly aggressive. His manipulation turned to anger. In his twisted sense of entitlement, he believed he could have her whenever he wanted. A scream echoed down the hallway of the penthouse suite, though it was muffled by the walls. As Walters reached for Rebecca, she snapped, pulling a letter opener from his desk drawer. The small, sleek weapon was meant for opening envelopes, not for what was about to unfold. In a flash of panic and desperation, Rebecca struck him once, then again, until his body slumped to the floor. It wasn't over. Rebecca, still in shock from the violence, backed away from the scene. She felt her pulse racing, her mind reeling. She had never intended to kill him, but the man who had terrorized her for months now lay dead at her feet. The sight of his blood pooling on the cold office floor made her heart race even faster. Was it self-defense? Or had the rage she'd kept bottled up finally come to the surface? In a daze, Rebecca stumbled backward, her hands trembling as she reached for her phone. She couldn't keep the details straight. She couldn't explain what had just happened. The fear of being caught overwhelmed her, and for a moment she considered fleeing the scene entirely. But Rebecca knew she couldn't leave without facing the consequences of what she had done. There was no escape from this now. She picked up the phone and dialed 911. "My boss, he's been killed." Her voice cracked, barely audible over the frantic breathing. The 911 dispatcher responded with calm precision, asking the necessary questions. Rebecca, still in shock, managed to give her location and inform them of the crime. The police were on their way, but the uncertainty of what would happen next was suffocating. Had anyone seen her leave the office? Had anyone heard the argument? Would she be believed? As she waited, the minutes felt like hours. She checked the body once more, confirming what she already knew. Jonathan Walters was dead. His life, his company, and his twisted obsession with her had come to an abrupt and violent end. But in the aftermath, Rebecca was left with no clear answers. The police arrived shortly after, securing the crime scene. The office was silent now, save for the occasional murmur from the officers, each one scanning for clues, piecing together what had just occurred. Rebecca stood, eyes wide as she was led away from the crime scene. Her hands were still covered in blood, proof of the violence that had unfolded in a place that had once been her workplace, her sanctuary. The murder of Jonathan Walters would not be an open and shut case. It would be a complex, layered investigation, one that would reveal the depths of Walter's obsession and the lengths Rebecca had gone to escape his grasp. What had started as a work relationship had turned into a fatal confrontation, and now both the victim and the perpetrator would have their stories told in a way that no one could have predicted. The investigation into Jonathan Walters' death began almost immediately, but the evidence at the crime scene painted a picture that was far from straightforward. Detective Sarah Fields, a veteran investigator with years of experience handling high-profile cases, was assigned to lead the investigation. From the moment she arrived at the Walters Technologies penthouse, she could tell that this wasn't just another crime scene. The sheer brutality of the murder, coupled with the lack of any forced entry or signs of struggle outside of the office, raised immediate red flags. Everything about the crime suggested that the victim knew his attacker. As the first officers entered the office, they observed the position of the body and the bloodstains. Jonathan Walters was found sprawled on the polished marble floor, a single stab wound to his chest. The letter opener, still embedded in his body, was the clear weapon of choice, and the amount of blood suggested that Walters had died quickly, though not without putting up some resistance. The office showed signs of a violent struggle, papers scattered, furniture overturned, and a chair knocked over, but remarkably, there were no signs of forced entry. The windows were locked, and the door had been closed behind Rebecca, indicating that she had been inside when the murder occurred. The investigators' initial theory was that this was a crime of passion, a personal attack carried out by someone who knew Walters intimately. But there was more to this story, and Detective Fields was determined to uncover it. Rebecca Lawson was quickly detained and brought in for questioning. She appeared calm, almost too calm for someone who had just committed such a violent act. Her initial statements were vague and inconsistent, and her nerves showed through as she fidgeted in her chair. She claimed that Walters had become aggressive during a confrontation, though she never went into detail about the nature of the altercation. The blood on her hands and clothes told a different story. She had been the only one in the room with Walters when he died. Detective Fields immediately turned her attention to the physical evidence. The blood spatter at the crime scene indicated that the murder had been close and personal. The wound itself was deep, and the lack of defensive wounds on Walters' body suggested that the attack had been swift, catching him off guard. A forensic analysis of the letter opener revealed traces of both Walters and Rebecca's DNA, confirming that Rebecca had been the one to stab Walters. But there was one piece of evidence that would prove to be pivotal in the case: Walters' phone. The phone records revealed something that the investigators hadn't anticipated. For months, Walters had been keeping a detailed record of his communications with Rebecca, his assistant. The texts, phone calls, and emails indicated a deepening obsession with her. But what stood out was the disturbing shift in the tone of their interactions leading up to the murder. Walters' messages had begun to take on a possessive tone, pushing for more than just a professional relationship. The texts were filled with demands, threats of professional repercussions, and veiled attempts to manipulate Rebecca into complying with his desires. Some of his messages were even borderline threatening, suggesting that Rebecca would lose her job if she didn't play along with his advances. What the investigators hadn't expected, however, was a discovery within Walters' personal files. As they scoured his office and personal belongings, they found a hidden folder on his laptop containing private, intimate photos of Rebecca. Some of these were taken without her knowledge, and all appeared to be from moments of vulnerability. In addition to the photos, there were detailed notes about her behavior, her personal life, and her movements, information that no employer had any business collecting. It was clear that Walters had been obsessively documenting Rebecca's life in an attempt to exert control over her. But the discovery of these photos only raised more questions. How far had Walters' obsession really gone? Did Rebecca act in self-defense, or was there more to the story? The investigators were beginning to see a dangerous pattern. Rebecca had been subjected to constant psychological manipulation by her boss, but that didn't necessarily justify the murder. Detective Fields knew that they needed to dig deeper into Rebecca's life and uncover the full extent of the relationship between her and Walters. Over the next few days, investigators began to scrutinize Rebecca's personal history. They found evidence that she had tried to distance herself from Walters multiple times. She had sought advice from colleagues, confided in friends, and even looked into transferring to a different department within the company. But Walters' power, both professional and personal, kept her locked in place. She was trapped between losing her job and enduring the harassment. It was becoming clear that Rebecca's decision to kill Walters wasn't impulsive. It had been the result of prolonged stress, fear, and manipulation. As the days went by, the investigation began to focus more heavily on the timeline of events leading up to Walters' death. Security footage from the building's surveillance cameras showed Rebecca entering the office complex at 9:00 a.m. that morning, as she usually did. Walters arrived shortly after, and they were seen interacting briefly in the elevator before going their separate ways for the day. However, footage from later in the afternoon raised new questions. Around 2:00 p.m., Rebecca was seen entering Walters' office, a few minutes before Walters entered, as seen in the security logs. At this point, the investigators began to suspect that this wasn't a spontaneous confrontation. It had been planned. Further forensic investigation also revealed that Rebecca had wiped her fingerprints from several items in the office, including Walter's desk and his personal belongings. Though it was clear that she hadn't planned on killing him from the outset, it appeared she had tried to cover her tracks after the fact. It was as though she had been aware of the gravity of what had just happened and had attempted to mask her involvement. But, despite the mounting evidence, there was something missing: a clear motive. While the evidence suggested that Rebecca had been pushed to the edge, the question remained. Was she acting in self-defense, or was there a deeper, more sinister layer to this crime? In the weeks following the murder, Detective Fields and her team would continue to unravel the twisted relationship between the victim and the accused. But they also knew that the case wasn't as clear-cut as it seemed. The truth was more complicated than anyone had initially imagined. The investigation had shifted from focusing solely on Rebecca as the perpetrator to examining the larger picture: how Walters had used his power to manipulate and control Rebecca, and how far his obsession had pushed her toward a final, deadly act. The investigation into Jonathan Walters' murder seemed straightforward at first. Rebecca Lawson, his assistant, had been the only person in the office at the time of his death, and all evidence pointed to her. She had confessed to stabbing him in what she claimed was an act of self-defense. However, Detective Sarah Fields began to feel that there was something missing. The more she examined the evidence, the more questions emerged. Was this really a case of a victimized assistant fighting back against an obsessive CEO? Or was there something darker at play? The breakthrough came when a forensic analysis of Rebecca's phone records revealed a series of cryptic messages exchanged with someone Walters had never known: an unnamed individual with ties to a rival tech company. As Fields dug deeper, the connection became clear. Rebecca had been in contact with the person in the weeks leading up to Walter's murder. The messages were more than casual exchanges. They were discussions of corporate strategy, and most troubling of all, plans to take down Walters himself. Rebecca had not only been working for Jonathan Walters, but had also been playing a dangerous game behind his back. It wasn't just her career that Rebecca had been maneuvering for. In reality, Rebecca had been secretly plotting to oust Walters from his own company. She had been secretly colluding with Daniel Walters, Jonathan's estranged brother, who had long sought to take control of the company. The two of them had devised a plan, using Rebecca's position as Jonathan's assistant to gather inside information and manipulate Walters into a vulnerable position. Their goal was to use Rebecca's access to undermine him in such a way that would eventually allow Daniel to take over as CEO. This revelation shifted the entire investigation. The murder wasn't just a result of a CEO's obsession with his assistant. It was the final, bloody step in a long-standing scheme that had been brewing for months. Rebecca had not been an innocent victim of Walter's advances. She had been an active participant in orchestrating his downfall. The most shocking discovery came from a hidden folder on Rebecca's phone: encrypted communications between her and Daniel Walters, along with details of their plan to sabotage Jonathan's career. They had been preparing for Jonathan to lose control of the company, but Rebecca's role had always been more than just a passive one. She was a player, not just a pawn. She had been feeding Daniel confidential information about Jonathan's professional and personal life, giving him the upper hand. Rebecca's complicity in the scheme raised unsettling questions. Was her violent outburst in the office truly an act of self-defense? Detective Fields now believed that it wasn't. The more the investigation unfolded, the more it seemed that Rebecca had been using Walter's obsession with her to further her own hidden agenda. Walters had been an obstacle to her and Daniel's ambitions, and now, in his office, he had become a liability that needed to be removed. But that wasn't all. As Detective Fields dug further into the background of the case, another shocking twist emerged. Investigators discovered that just days before the murder, Rebecca had made a large cash transfer to an offshore account, an account linked to a shell corporation that was tied to the same rival company she had been in contact with. This financial trail painted a disturbing picture. Rebecca had been preparing for life after Walters, ensuring that she would have the financial means to support herself and Daniel once they took over the company. Rebecca's confession about the murder took on new meaning. She had not only killed Jonathan Walters out of fear or desperation, she had killed him to secure her future. The murder, she now admitted, had been the final act in a long-planned strategy to eliminate the man who stood in her way. She had never intended to be caught. The plan had been simple: stage the murder to appear as a result of Walter's obsessive behavior, making it seem like he had pushed her too far. Once he was gone, she and Daniel would step into positions of power, but the investigation didn't end there. The most shocking revelation came from a further investigation into Daniel Walters' involvement in the case. It turned out that Daniel had been working behind the scenes to manipulate Rebecca into helping him take control of the company. He had promised her a share of the company once Jonathan was out of the picture, and Rebecca had fallen for it. But the power struggle between the brothers had been more complex than anyone had realized. Daniel had been playing both Rebecca and Jonathan, and it seemed that no one in this twisted triangle could trust anyone else. Rebecca's attempt to justify her actions in self-defense fell apart. It was clear that she had played a key role in the murder, not out of desperation, but as part of a calculated plan. In the end, she had murdered Jonathan Walters to serve her own interests, manipulating both him and Daniel to achieve her goals. As the investigation moved forward, Rebecca was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Her actions, though seemingly a result of Walter's obsession, were revealed to be part of a much larger and more sinister plot. Daniel Walters, too, was implicated, though his direct involvement in the murder remained unclear. The case would continue to unfold, with more twists to come. But what had begun as a seemingly straightforward case of a CEO's obsession with his assistant had turned into a conspiracy of manipulation, betrayal, and murder. Detective Fields knew that the case was far from over. While Rebecca's confession and the evidence against her were damning, the involvement of Daniel Walters remained a troubling mystery that would need to be unraveled in the coming months. The shocking revelations had only scratched the surface of a much darker story that was yet to be fully told. The trial of Rebecca Lawson for the murder of Jonathan Walters quickly became a high-profile legal battle, attracting public and media attention. The courtroom drama unfolded with surprising complexity, as Rebecca, once seen as a victim of a CEO's obsessive behavior, now stood at the center of a calculated conspiracy. The prosecution's case was direct. They presented evidence showing that Rebecca had not acted out of self-defense, as initially claimed, but had instead played an active role in plotting Walter's downfall. Their argument was clear. Rebecca had been involved in a covert conspiracy with Daniel Walters, Jonathan's estranged brother, to take over Walters' technologies. They had carefully manipulated Jonathan, using his obsession with Rebecca to engineer his removal from the company. Key evidence included encrypted communications between Rebecca and Daniel, where they discussed plans to undermine Jonathan. These texts and emails were vital in showing that Rebecca had been a willing participant in the scheme, not just a victim of Jonathan's advances. The prosecution also revealed that Rebecca had made large financial transactions, including an offshore account transfer days before the murder, indicating she was preparing for life after Jonathan's death. The defense team, on the other hand, argued that Rebecca's actions were a result of Jonathan Walters' obsessive behavior. They claimed she had been trapped in a toxic, abusive work environment and had acted out of fear for her safety. The defense tried to portray Rebecca as a woman who had been pushed too far, arguing that Jonathan's increasing manipulation and threats had forced her into a corner. Despite these claims, the defense faced an uphill battle. While Jonathan's obsession with Rebecca was documented, it didn't explain the depth of her involvement in the conspiracy. The prosecution pointed out that Rebecca had used Jonathan's obsession against him, pretending to be a helpless assistant while secretly plotting his demise. They argued that the murder wasn't a sudden outburst of fear, but a premeditated act driven by Rebecca's desire to advance her own career. As the trial unfolded, the defense attempted to highlight Jonathan's obsession, using his personal journals to suggest that he had been unreasonably fixated on Rebecca, even planning to use his influence to control her. This, they argued, contributed to Rebecca's actions. However, the prosecution countered by emphasizing Rebecca's manipulative behavior, showing that her actions were not those of a passive victim, but a strategic player in a larger game of corporate power. The trial took another twist when the prosecution revealed that Rebecca had been in contact with a corporate rival before the murder. These communications suggested that Rebecca had been planning her escape from Walters Technologies for months, and her ultimate goal was not just self-defense, but to assume control of the company. As the evidence piled up, it became clear that Rebecca had been calculating her steps from the beginning. Her apparent innocence, shaped by her role as a victim, unraveled with each new piece of evidence. The jury now had to decide if she had truly acted in fear for her life, or if she had meticulously planned Jonathan Walters' murder to further her own ambitions. The turning point came when a key witness, a former colleague of Rebecca's, testified that she had overheard Rebecca discussing her plans to bring down Jonathan. This testimony, combined with the physical evidence and financial records, left little room for doubt. Rebecca had been involved in a conspiracy that had gone far beyond the realm of a simple affair gone wrong. In the end, the jury deliberated for just over 2 days before returning with a verdict. Rebecca Lawson was found guilty of second-degree murder. While the jury acknowledged that Jonathan Walters' obsessive behavior had played a role in the events leading to his death, they determined that Rebecca's actions were deliberate and motivated by personal gain. She had manipulated her way into a position of power and had been an active participant in the plot to remove Jonathan from his position as CEO. The courtroom was tense as the verdict was read. Rebecca's face showed no emotion as she was escorted out of the courtroom in handcuffs. While the prosecution had painted her as a ruthless corporate manipulator, the defense had portrayed her as a victim of abuse. The jury found a middle ground, acknowledging her culpability but also recognizing the toxic relationship she had endured. Rebecca was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison for her role in Jonathan Walters' murder. Her plot had come to a tragic and violent end, but the case left lingering questions about the nature of ambition, manipulation, and the lengths people will go to for power. As for Daniel Walters, he was arrested and charged with conspiracy to commit murder. The case against him was still unfolding, but the role he played in the larger scheme was now undeniable. The Walters family business was left in ruins, and the company that had once been a shining example of corporate success was now tainted by betrayal and murder. The trial served as a reminder that behind the polished facades of business and power, dark secrets often lie hidden, waiting to be exposed. As the trial concluded and Rebecca Lawson was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison, the full extent of the betrayal became undeniable. What began as a simple corporate affair had spiraled into a deadly conspiracy, leaving a CEO dead, a family torn apart, and a once thriving company now stained by its dark past. Rebecca Lawson, once seen as a victim, was revealed to be an active player in a plot to take down Jonathan Walters and seize control of the company. The case exposed the lengths to which ambition and obsession can drive people when power, money, and revenge are at stake. The shocking revelation that Daniel Walters had been involved in the conspiracy further complicated the case. While Rebecca was convicted of murder, the full extent of Daniel's role in orchestrating the events is yet to be fully realized. The Walters family's internal collapse has left the tech world reeling, as a high-profile corporation crumbles under the weight of deceit and betrayal. As you reflect on the twisted events that led to Jonathan Walters' death, ask yourself, how far can the desire for control push someone? What happens when trust and loyalty are replaced by ambition and greed? The true cost of betrayal is never just the life of the victim. It extends to everyone caught in the web of lies. Rebecca Lawson's story serves as a chilling reminder of how even the most polished and seemingly trustworthy individuals can harbor dangerous secrets. What's more unsettling is that we may never fully understand the depths of betrayal and manipulation behind closed doors. Sometimes the truth is darker than we can imagine.